This is the SAUCY SINKER experiment. You're going to see why it's called that in a second. Here we have some sachets of various dressings and sauces and so on that you might put on food, although we do actually have one with coffee in it. Most restaurants have these sorts of things in. What you need to do is find one that floats. Now, I'm not going to suggest to you how you might test it in the restaurant. I have my ways of doing it. I'll leave you to think of that. But you need to find a sachet, and there's a selection here, but this is a nice one, that floats, because not all of them do. So just test it in some water, and if it floats, it will work for this experiment, okay? Problem is, that's not floating the way I want it to. It floats really well. It's actually pretty much laying on the water, as you can see. If I push it down, it comes up pretty fast. I'm going to put a weight on it because I actually want it to float downwards in the water like that. Now, what I recommend you use, and I've already got one here ready to show you, is a paper clip. So just put a paper clip on. Now, it may be the paper clip you use might actually be a bit too heavy, the whole thing will sink, or it might be too light and it will still float on the surface. I recommend using smaller paper clips and put one on the first, see what it does. If it totally sinks, then you may have to, of course, use a slightly heavier paper clip or put two small ones on. So you might have to experiment a little bit, but what I want you to do is have it so that when it's floating in water, it floats like that. And as you can see, it's floating now that way, but it is actually at the surface. And that's what I want you to do, okay? So remember, you may need to use more paper clips or different size paper clips, but I think they're the best things to use, but you might come up with some other ideas that will work just as well. Once you've tested your SAUCY SINKER, and I think you've got a clue about something now, I want you to remove the glass jug of water, because you don't need that now, and I want you to find a bottle. I'm going to use a large 2-litre bottle. You'll notice I'm placing it in this glass tray because if the water spills, at least for where I am on this lovely table, it will just go onto the saucer here. You could use a sink, is probably the best place to do it at home, or somewhere else where it's easy to wipe it. Now, you'll notice, of course, that this is quite a wide sachet. Obviously, you're going to have to bend it. Now, I recommend, of course, I want it to float that way. Do you remember when it was in the jug? The weight of the paper clip was pulling it down, and that's the same direction we want it in the bottle. So have the paper clip in first, push it into the bottle, and get your little finger, if you need to, or big finger, whatever fits, and poke it right down in, so it's down in, lovely. Now, you'll notice some of the water has come out. That's fine, just top it up. So it right to the top so it flows over the top again, and then you find the lid for the bottle and you put the lid on the bottle, okay, and screw it up nice and tightly, tight. Then what I want you to do is put your hands around the bottle and as hard as you can give it a good squeeze. So if you give the bottle a good squeeze, let's see what happens on my one. Squeeze. Take your hand off. Squeeze again. Take your hand off. And there we have the SAUCY SINKER. So, how does this work? Why does the sachet sink in the water when you squeeze the bottle? What we've made is a version of something called a Cartesian diver, sometimes known as Descartes' diver, but most books that write about it call it a Cartesian diver. And it's named after the person, as far as we know, who first made one nearly 400 years ago, called René Descartes. And he's quite a famous man. He was a really good scientist, mathematician, all-round genius, and he was the first one that made one as far as we know. He didn't use these materials, but his worked in a similar way. Now, when you squeeze this plastic bottle, of course, you're squashing the water inside. Now, water, of course, is a liquid, and it's very difficult to squash liquids into a smaller volume or a smaller space. One of the reasons for this is because the atoms and molecules that the water's made of are all quite close together anyway, and it's very difficult to squash them even closer. So when you squeeze the bottle, the water doesn't fit into a smaller space easily, and it has nowhere else to go because it's full up. But when you squeeze the bottle, what can happen is the water will squash the sachet. Now, what you need to remember is, inside this sachet is a little bubble, or possibly several bubbles right now. They are a certain size. Of course, we can't see them, so we don't know how big they actually are, but they're a certain size, and they're obviously big enough to be keeping this floating. Of course, you can, by the way, actually get see-through sachets with sauces in, and you will be able to see the bubbles usually in those, so that might be worth thinking about. Right now, of course, we're using one where we can't see them. So when I squeeze the bottle, I squeeze the water, and then the water squashes against the sides of the sachet, and of course then it squashes the tiny bubbles that are inside, making them even smaller. Because remember, a bubble is full of gas, and gases are really easy to squash into a smaller space. Your lungs are doing it now. So when you squeeze it, those bubbles actually get smaller inside, and smaller bubbles don't float so well. So they're not big enough to support the weight of the whole sachet. So when we squeeze it, the bubbles get smaller, so the whole thing sinks now because it's too heavy for the little bubbles to keep up. When I release my hands, I release the pressure in the water, those little tiny bubbles that we can't see trapped inside the sachet go back to the same size again, so the whole thing floats back up again. So what other things could you investigate to see what's going to happen? Well, how about you try a selection of different sachets? I've already shown you a few here. There's lots more that float, so how about trying different ones? Remember to still set them in the same way as before, using a jug of water or whatever way you choose to do to make sure they float. Put them in, see if they all work in the same way. How about putting more than one sachet of a different type in the same bottle to see what they do? Or even the same type, will even these two behave in the same way? Because they are apparently the same, so will they behave the same way? How about trying different size bottles? That's worth thinking about. Remember, we're using a 2-litre bottle here. How about trying something much, much smaller? Perhaps even something as small as that. Remember, of course, when you use a smaller bottle, it's not going to be able to travel so far, but nevertheless, you can still do the experiment. What about different liquids? I'm using water here. How about if you get a bottle of cooking oil and gently push it in? Could be a bit messy, so be careful on this one. So push it gently into the cooking oil and see if it works with cooking oil. And I'm sure you can think of some other things too.